last 30 years, the forces of autocracy
принято решение о проведении специальной военной
The
операции.
Russian army is committing barbaric actions.
Welcome to the summary lecture on understanding the war in Ukraine. We began this series in the aftermath of the war during the month of March. And ever since, we've had the privilege of conducting conversations with you, over 1 million of you, in the past few months through 11 framing episodes, which were about the general situation, about Finland, about Europe, about the world, about Russia, China, the US, NATO. They were about power, the instruments of power, the West and the rest, and the new world order. On top of that, we've had wonderful Q&A sessions with you, and we had interviews with specialists on the economy, on EU enlargement, on energy, on technology, and on the transatlantic relationship. Now, what we'll aim to do today is to give you a summary of how we see the situation roughly 130 days into the war. And I'll do it through 3 questions and a conclusion. The 3 questions are: why did this war happen? Second question, how did we react to it? And then third question, what are the ramifications? When I move to the conclusion, I'll ask questions about how it might end, how we will reconstruct or rebuild Ukraine, and also this tension between what we call peace and justice. So here we go. Point and question number 1. Why did this happen? I think there are actually 3 reasons why this war took place and why it was kicked off. The first one is Russian imperialism. It is linked to this innate thinking in Russia that it is a great power, it has spheres of interest, and a belief that it has a strong role in history to protect many things, including, of course, Russian language, Russian religion, Russian leadership, and Russian territory. And this feeling that it's always surrounded and attacked by someone else. So therefore, the idea was to make, if you will, or keep Russia great. The second reason for this war is very human. It is Putin's legacy, where he sees himself in history. And I've always said that if you want to understand Putin, understand Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Stalin. That is the category of leadership where he sees himself and where he wants to see himself in history. And as we all know, life comes to an end at some stage. And when you start looking back at what you have done and what you have achieved, there is the element of legacy. And especially with what I call strongman leaders. So was it not for Putin's sort of legacy, I don't think this war would have taken place. The third and final reason, the real reason for this war is the fear of democracy. The fear of democracy in Kremlin and with Russian leadership. This war was not about NATO expansion. It was not about EU expansion. It was a fear of a way of life. Remember that Russia thinks quite often that it has had to save, sometimes correctly, itself from Napoleon and from Hitler, and now it wants to save Europe from Western liberal democracy and decadence. So 3 reasons why it happened: Russian imperialism, Putin's legacy, and fear of democracy. Second question and point today. How did we react? Well, again, 3 ways. Number 1, Ukraine showed and has showed tremendous resilience. Remember, in the beginning of the war, I don't think that there were many, first of all, who believed that Putin would attack, but secondly, that Ukraine and Zelensky would last. And they have lasted. Not only that, they have pushed back. Some thought that this would be a conflict that would be over in 48 hours or 72 hours maximum. And even in the beginning of the conflict, Putin gave statements about, yes, our special operations are advancing well, it'll be probably over in about a week. Well, here we are, 130 days later, and we'll see that Ukraine's resilience has been strong. May I add that my second point of reaction, Western unity, would not have happened in such a way was it not for Ukrainian resistance. I have never seen the West, especially the European Union, but also the United States and the United Kingdom, as efficient, as unified, and as determined to react to a certain situation. And I think this took Putin by surprise. The 6 waves of sanctions, the total isolation of Russia, the provision of armaments to Ukraine, the political support to Ukraine, the financial support to Ukraine, the demonstrations on European streets. This came as a surprise, I think, for a lot of pundits, but especially to Putin. This Western unity has been strong, and I've never seen it stronger. The third reaction that we've dealt with in this lecture series as well is what I call a global split, or the West and the rest. We warned early on in the conflict that this is not only about Russia and the West, this is as much about the West and the rest. Yes, we took joy in the fact that 141 states in the UN voted against Russia, 35 abstained and 4 in favor, but we realized very quickly that the 141 votes were actually quite soft and scrambled last minute. The 35 abstaining votes are over half of the world's population, and then of course the 4 rogue states we didn't care about that much. But there's clearly a sentiment around the world that, listen, Europe, this is your war. It has ramifications on us in terms of inflation, energy prices, food prices, prices of fertilizer, but it is your war and deal with it. So the sympathy, not so much about Ukraine, but about the West and the US hasn't been there 100%. We've seen that on the African continent, we've seen that in Latin America, and we've seen that in Asia as well. So how did we react? Ukrainians reacted heroically through resilience. The West reacted with unity, unlike we've seen before, and the world reacted with a certain distance and taking a split. I don't blame them, but this is a reality that we need to look at a little bit closer. The third and final question I have today, what then are the ramifications of this war? Here I come back to the early statement that I made that we shouldn't over-rationalize the past, over-dramatize the present, and underestimate the future. So I'm very reluctant to draw far-reaching conclusions. But I am quite confident in saying that this is one of these big moments in history. 1917, 1944-45, 1989, 1991. You know, if Fukuyama talked about the end of history, I would like to call this the beginning of history. What does this mean? For me, it means 3 things. 2 are systemic and 1 is practical. The first systemic consequence of this war is a new European security order, basically, which means a split. On one side of the fence, the new Iron Curtain, you have an isolated Russia, which will be, at the end of the day, fully isolated politically, economically, financially, sports culture, energy, transport, you name it. And on the other side of the fence, you have more or less 40 European democracies that believe in cooperation, integration, pooling sovereignty, international law, rule of law, human rights, and fundamental rights. And this is the new Iron Curtain that will split Europe into 2, both politically and economically. Second consequence, I think we will see the beginning of a reflection of a new world order. And I do understand that this feels a little bit uncomfortable for us in the West, because in many ways we have been the rule setters since World War II. So if you look at the international world order, whether you look at the UN, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, you name it, it is pretty much created in the image of the West. And because the world has changed and the gravity of the world is not anymore in Europe or in the United States, it's also elsewhere, I think there'll be even legitimate claims about stake and agency in the international order. So I think this conversation will begin. I myself have argued that we moved from a Cold War, which was bipolar, to a post-Cold War, which was unipolar, and now to a post-Ukraine world, which is multipolar, where you have different players dealing with different issues. That's why in this lecture series we've talked about the instruments of power, which are new to the world as well, and which we are reflecting because of this war. The final, third and practical ramification of this war, apart from a European security split and a new world order, is short-term issues related to slow growth and inflation, which of course spells stagflation, which is linked to oil prices or energy prices in general, to potential food crisis or at least food prices, to prices of fertilizer and disruption in value chain. So there is this sentiment that these things might have an impact on globalization. Some people talk about deglobalization. We in this lecture series have talked about not so much deglobalization, but the regionalization of globalization, which actually already began with, well, say, the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and certainly with COVID, but is now pushed to the limit with the war. Now, here's where I come to my conclusion and summary in this 12th and final lecture before the summer break on understanding the war in Ukraine. I think we have to start reflecting about three things. The first one is this tension between what the European Council of Foreign Relations has called the peace camp and the justice camp. And by that I mean to say that you have a group of people that legitimately claim that we need to achieve peace and we need to achieve it now. Then you have a group of people who say, no, we want justice. Russia has been wrong. It should not get away with annexing territory from an independent and sovereign nation state. We need to start finding this balance. And the reason I say that is that I think that war fatigue is beginning to hit in. It's natural, it's understandable. People start looking at their own wallet, at their own situation in life. And it's not easy with energy prices, with food prices, and with a refugee crisis in Europe as well. So that's why this whole debate on peace versus justice and where we find the balance must begin. Secondly, and this is going to be extremely complicated, we need to start reflecting on how this war will end. Because every war has to have an end. We can't allow this to become a protracted war which lasts for months or even years. And this will require really difficult conversations about an end game. What will it mean in terms of territorial loss if it does? What will it mean in terms of sovereignty? What will it mean in terms of international engagement for a country like Ukraine? And also, what will it mean in terms of indicting war criminals from Russia, because we all understand that war crimes have taken place. So there needs to be this conversation about an endgame. I'm not going to give you the options at this stage. I personally feel that we're not there yet, but this conversation will have to begin somewhere, and also a discussion about what kind of security guarantees Ukraine gets. Then finally and thirdly, this is a thing that we need to look into as well, and that is the reconstruction of Ukraine. We're now talking, according to experts, that Ukraine needs somewhere between 5 to 8 billion euros a month just to survive. Well, add on to that the beginning of the reconstruction of a country that has large chunks of it actually completely destroyed. Who will foot the bill and in which way? The Americans have carried the burden of the war and equipment, as has actually Europeans, but I would assume that Europeans will end up footing the bill for the reconstruction, but we need to find a European or a global Marshall Plan on how to deal with this. So I would like to thank all of you for watching this lecture series, which has had over 1 million views. And I think it's important that as we move towards summer reflection, that we don't forget the war, that we continue to advocate and discuss, not the war, but of course advocate a solution. And that's why I today wanted to give you 3 reasons why the war happened, 3 reasons how we reacted to it, and 3 points about the actual ramifications. With these words, thank you very much for following, and remember to follow our YouTube channel as well. Have a nice summer.
Over the last 30 years, the forces of
Мною
autocracy
принято решение о проведении специальной военной
The
операции.
Russian army is committing barbaric actions